woke up this morning. You checked the time. You ate something quick. You left your apartment and joined a stream of strangers heading to work through noisy streets. Around midday, you grabbed a fast meal you barely tasted. By late afternoon, your body was tired but your mind was restless. So you went somewhere to unwind, maybe a gym, maybe a bar, maybe a long hot shower. Then you came home, ate dinner, and the city outside your window kept making noise long after you wanted silence. You think that is modern life. You think that rhythm was invented by industrial cities, by electricity, by capitalism, by the 21st century. It was not. Nearly 2,000 years ago, in a city of roughly 1 million people jammed into an area smaller than Manhattan, a Roman citizen woke up, checked the time, ate something quick, walked through deafening streets to work, grabbed a fast meal at a street counter, went to a public bath to unwind, came home, had dinner, and tried to sleep while the city raged outside. The sequence was almost identical to yours. The smells were worse. The apartment was smaller. The meal was cheaper. But the shape of the day, hour by hour, was yours. This is not a coincidence. You did not independently invent that rhythm. You inherited it. The way you move through a single day, from dawn to darkness, is a Roman invention you have never questioned because you have never noticed it. Today, we are going to walk through one ordinary day in ancient Rome, hour by hour, and by the end you will realize that 20 centuries have changed far less than you think. The city that made this possible sat on 7 low hills along a muddy, yellow-green river called the Tiber, about 25 kilometers inland from the western coast of Italy. It was not a beautiful location. The river flooded regularly. The low ground between the hills turned into malarial swamp every summer. The hills themselves were modest, none of them taller than 50 meters, roughly the height of a 15-story building. There was no natural harbor, no deep-water port, no obvious reason why this particular bend in this particular river should have become the center of the Western world. But by the 1st century of the Common Era, Rome had swallowed the Mediterranean. Its empire stretched from the rain-soaked moors of northern Britain to the sandstone cliffs of the Nile, from the Atlantic coast of Portugal to the banks of the Euphrates in modern Iraq. 50 million people, perhaps 60, lived under its authority, and the capital itself had grown into something the ancient world had never seen before and would not see again for over 1,000 years. A city of approximately 1 million inhabitants, fed by grain ships from Egypt, watered by 11 aqueducts, carrying over 1 million cubic meters of fresh water every single day, and connected to the rest of the empire by 80,000 kilometers of paved roads. 1 million people. To put that in perspective, London would not reach that population until the early 1800s. When Rome had 1 million residents, the entire population of the British Isles was probably around 2 million. Paris had perhaps 30,000 people during the Roman period. The city of Rome was, by a staggering margin, the largest human settlement on the planet. And those 1 million people needed a rhythm. They needed to know when to wake, when to work, when to eat, when to rest. They needed a shared clock. The problem was that Roman clocks did not work the way ours do. The Romans divided every day into 12 hours of light and 12 hours of darkness. But those hours were not fixed. They expanded and contracted with the seasons. In midsummer, a Roman hour of daylight lasted roughly 75 of our minutes. In midwinter, it shrank to about 45. The concept of an hour as a rigid, unchanging 60-minute block did not exist. Time itself was elastic, breathing with the sun, and the entire daily routine bent and stretched around it. Let us step into that elastic time. Hora prima, the first hour, dawn. In a July morning, this would be roughly 5:30 by our reckoning. In December, closer to 7:30. Either way, Rome did not wake gently. The ordinary Roman, the one who was not a senator or a wealthy merchant, lived in an insula, a multi-story apartment block built of concrete, timber, and hope. These buildings rose 4, 5, sometimes 6 stories high along narrow streets that rarely saw direct sunlight. The ground floors housed shops, taverns, and bakeries. The upper floors held cramped apartments, many of them single rooms shared by entire families. There was no running water above the first floor. There was no glass in most windows, only wooden shutters that let in either air or darkness, but never both at the same time. There was no toilet. A chamber pot served that purpose, and its contents were carried downstairs every morning, or, as Roman satirists like to complain, simply thrown out the window. The poet Martial, who lived in a third-floor apartment during the reign of Domitian in the late 1st century, wrote about being woken before dawn by the sound of a schoolteacher beating students in the shop below. He complained about bakers pounding dough, coppersmiths hammering metal, and money changers clinking coins on stone counters. Rome, he made clear, was a city that did not believe in silence, and so the ordinary Roman woke to noise. He dressed quickly because Roman clothing was simple. A tunic, a single rectangular piece of wool or linen belted at the waist, was the universal garment for men, women, slaves, and free citizens alike. Over the tunic, if you were a male citizen of some standing, you draped the toga, a massive semicircular cloth, roughly 6 meters long, that required either practice or a slave to wrap properly. Most working Romans skipped the toga entirely. It was hot, heavy, impractical, and reserved for formal occasions, funerals, elections, and visits to powerful men. That last part mattered, because the first activity of the Roman morning, for any citizen who depended on a patron, was the salutatio. This was the daily ritual of visiting your social superior at his house, standing in his entrance hall alongside dozens of other clients, greeting him formally, and receiving in return a small basket of food or a handful of coins called the sportula. The relationship between patron and client was one of the defining structures of Roman society. It was neither employment nor friendship. It was obligation dressed as generosity, dependence dressed as respect. You showed up. You waited. You smiled. You received your portion. You left. The salutatio happened during the first and second hours, roughly from dawn until mid-morning. Across the city, streams of men in their best tunics walked through the streets toward the houses of the wealthy on the Palatine and Esquiline hills. The streets were already crowded. Julius Caesar had banned wheeled traffic from Rome during daylight hours because the congestion had become impossible. Only construction carts and certain official vehicles were allowed. Everything else moved on foot, on the backs of slaves, or on litters carried by teams of 4 to 8 men. The result was a city of pedestrians, and the sidewalks, where they existed, were as packed as any modern subway platform during rush hour. By the third hour, hora tertia, roughly 9 in the morning during summer, the business day had begun. Rome did not have offices in our sense. Business happened in the open air, in the forum, in basilicas that functioned as combined courthouses and trading floors, in the porticos of temples, and in the tabernae that lined every major street. The Forum Romanum, the ancient heart of the city, was a rectangular plaza roughly 130 meters long and 50 meters wide, smaller than a modern soccer field, and yet every morning it contained the concentrated political, legal, financial, and religious life of an empire governing 50 million people. Lawyers argued cases in the basilicas. Senators debated in the curia. Moneylenders set up portable tables near the Temple of Casta. Scribes sat cross-legged on the steps, writing letters for those who could not write themselves, which was a substantial portion of the population. Literacy in the Roman Empire is difficult to estimate, but most historians place it somewhere between 15 and 30%, far higher than most pre-modern societies, but far lower than we might assume from a civilization that left us so much written material. The noise was tremendous. Latin was a language designed to be spoken loudly and in public. Roman oratory was a physical performance. Cicero trained his voice the way an athlete trains a muscle. Even casual conversation in the forum would have sounded, to modern ears, like an argument. Around the 5th or 6th hour, roughly noon, the Roman workday paused. It did not end, but it bent. This was the time for prandium, the midday meal, and it was remarkably similar to the modern concept of a quick lunch. Most Romans did not go home to eat. They stopped at a thermopolium, a street-front food counter that served hot, ready-made food from large clay jars set into a stone countertop. Pompeii, preserved under the ash of Vesuvius in 79 AD, has revealed over 150 of these establishments, roughly one for every 60 to 80 residents. They served lentil stew, coarse bread, cheese, olives, cheap wine mixed with water, and occasionally roasted meat. You stood at the counter, ate quickly, and moved on. The thermopolium was Roman fast food. It existed because most ordinary Romans did not have kitchens. The insulae were fire traps. Open flames in upper-story apartments were either banned or suicidal. Cooking happened downstairs, in commercial establishments, and the Roman diet was accordingly shaped by what could be sold hot and cheap from a counter. This is not trivial. The next time you stand at a lunch counter in any city on earth, eating something quick before going back to work, you are performing a Roman act in a Roman space, following a Roman clock. After the midday meal, the city shifted. The 7th, 8th, and 9th hours, the long afternoon, belonged to the activity that defined Roman daily life more than any other, the bath. Roman public baths were not bathrooms. They were not even spas in the modern sense. They were the closest thing the ancient world produced to a community center, a gymnasium, a library, a park, and a social club combined into a single enormous complex, and they were available to virtually everyone. The great imperial baths, the Thermae of Caracalla, completed in 216 AD, or the Thermae of Diocletian, completed in 306 AD, could hold thousands of bathers simultaneously. The baths of Diocletian accommodated an estimated 3,000 people at a time, in a complex covering 13 hectares, larger than 11 football fields. The admission price was a quadrans, the smallest Roman coin, worth roughly 1/64th of a denarius. It was so cheap that many emperors waived it entirely on holidays. Women bathed as well, usually during separate hours in the morning, though mixed bathing occurred during certain periods and scandalized conservative Romans thoroughly. The bathing sequence was ritualized. You entered the apoditerium, the changing room, where you left your clothes in a niche or handed them to a slave. Theft was common, and Roman literature is full of complaints about stolen tunics. From there you moved to the palaestra, the exercise yard, where you might wrestle, throw a ball, lift weights made of stone, or simply walk. Exercise came before bathing, and it was vigorous enough that the philosopher Seneca, who lived above a bathhouse, wrote an exasperated letter about the grunting, slapping, shouting, and splashing that echoed through his floor every afternoon. After exercise, you entered the tepidarium, the warm room where the temperature was moderate and your body began to adjust. Then the caldarium, the hot room, thick with steam, heated by a hypocaust system that circulated hot air beneath raised floors and through hollow walls. The engineering was extraordinary. Furnaces burned constantly, fed by slaves who worked in shifts, and the heat distribution was precise enough that different rooms maintained different temperatures simultaneously. Finally, if you were brave, the frigidarium, the cold plunge pool, where you gasped and your skin tightened and the afternoon suddenly felt new. But the bath was not primarily about getting clean. It was about being social. Romans talked business in the tepidarium, They gossiped in the palaestra. They made deals, renewed friendships, settled disputes, and displayed their bodies, their scars, their wealth, and their connections in an environment where rank was stripped to the skin. A senator and a freedman stood in the same water. The bath was the closest Rome ever came to equality, and even that equality was an illusion, because the senator had a retinue of slaves oiling his skin, while the freedman scraped himself with a curved metal tool called a strigil. The baths also contained libraries. The baths of Caracalla had two, one for Greek texts and one for Latin. They contained gardens, sculpture galleries, and food vendors selling sausages, pastries, and wine. You could spend 3 or 4 hours at the baths and never touch water. This was by design. The emperors who built these complexes understood that a population kept comfortable, entertained, and clean was a population that did not riot. By the 10th hour, late afternoon, the bath emptied and the final section of the Roman day began. This was the time for cena, the main meal of the day, and it was the only meal that Romans treated as an event. For the wealthy, cena was an elaborate dinner party lasting 3 or 4 hours, with guests reclining on couches arranged in a U-shape around a low table, eating with their fingers, served by slaves, and entertained by musicians, poets, or acrobats. The meal progressed through courses: gustaccio, the appetizer, often eggs, olives, and raw vegetables; primae mensae, the main course, which could include roasted pork, fish in garum sauce, stuffed dormice for the adventurous, or simple chicken for the practical; and secundae mensae, the dessert, usually fruit, nuts, and honeyed pastries. Garum deserves a moment. It was the ketchup of the Roman world, a fermented fish sauce made by layering fish intestines with salt in large stone vats and leaving them in the sun for weeks or months until the mixture liquefied into a pungent, amber-colored liquid. Romans put garum on nearly everything. The best garum, called garum sociorum, was produced in factories along the coast of Spain and sold for prices comparable to expensive perfume. It sounds revolting to modern sensibilities, and yet fish sauce remains a staple of Southeast Asian cooking today. The flavor profile is almost identical. Rome's favorite condiment never disappeared. It simply moved east. For the ordinary Roman who could not afford a formal cena, the evening meal was simpler but still social. Families ate together in their cramped apartments or at the tables of taverns called popinae, establishments that Roman moralists constantly criticized as dens of gambling, drunkenness, and worse. Emperor Claudius reportedly tried to ban popinae from selling hot food, and Nero restricted their menus to vegetables and beans. The regulations were universally ignored. Romans liked their taverns the way they liked their baths: loud, crowded, and cheap. As darkness fell, Rome transformed. Without streetlights, without police patrols in most neighborhoods, without the wheeled traffic ban that kept daytime streets navigable, the city became genuinely dangerous. The satirist Juvenal, writing in the early 2nd century, described the nighttime streets as a gauntlet of falling roof tiles, emptied chamber pots, and drunken thugs looking for someone to beat. He advised anyone walking home after dinner to write a will before leaving the house. This was not entirely exaggeration. Rome had no professional police force until Augustus created the cohortes urbanae and the vigiles, a combined fire brigade and night watch of roughly 7,000 men. The vigils patrolled with buckets, axes, and blankets for smothering flames, because fire was the constant nightmare of a city built largely of timber and packed with 1 million people cooking, heating, and lighting their homes with open flame. The Great Fire of 64 AD under Nero burned for 6 days and destroyed or damaged 10 of Rome's 14 districts. It was catastrophic but not surprising. Smaller fires broke out constantly. Crassus, one of the richest men in Roman history, made part of his fortune by arriving at burning buildings with a team of slaves and offering to buy the property at a fraction of its value while the owner watched it burn. If the owner agreed, Crassus's slaves would extinguish the fire. If not, they watched. Night also brought the carts. Since wheeled vehicles were banned during the day, all heavy transport, building materials, grain shipments, wine barrels, marble columns moved through the streets after sunset. The noise was staggering. Iron-rimmed wheels on stone pavement, the shouts of drivers, the braying of mules, the crash of loads being unloaded at construction sites that worked through the night. Julius Caesar's original traffic ban solved daytime congestion by creating nighttime chaos, and every subsequent emperor kept the rule because the daytime alternative was worse. And so the ordinary Roman tried to sleep. In an upper-story apartment with no glass windows, thin walls and a street below that had suddenly become a freight corridor. Martial complained about it. Juvenal complained about it. Seneca complained about it. Sleep in Rome was not rest. It was surrender. A negotiation with noise that you could never win, only briefly postpone until the schoolteacher downstairs started beating his students again at dawn, and the cycle began once more. This rhythm, this daily wheel of waking and working and eating and bathing and dining and failing to sleep, did not last forever. The city that perfected it was already showing fractures by the late 2nd century. The Antonine Plague of 165 to 180 AD, likely smallpox, killed an estimated 5 million people across the empire. The population of Rome itself began to decline. By the 3rd century, civil wars, economic collapse, and the slow fragmentation of imperial authority had begun to hollow the city from within. The aqueducts still ran. The baths still opened. The thermopolia still served lentil stew. But the population dropped steadily. From 1 million to perhaps 800,000, then 500,000, then less. When the Visigoths under Alaric sacked Rome in 410 AD, the city still had perhaps 300,000 inhabitants. By the time Justinian's general Belisarius recaptured it for the Eastern Empire in 536 AD, during the Gothic Wars, the population may have fallen below 50,000. The aqueducts were cut during the siege. Without water, the great baths closed one by one, their hypocaust furnaces cold, their libraries empty, their exercise yards overgrown. The thermopolia shuttered, the insulae crumbled. The Forum, once the noisiest rectangle on earth, fell silent and filled with earth and rubble until its original pavement lay buried under 6 meters of debris. The daily rhythm of 1 million people simply stopped. But it did not die. The calendar you follow, with its 12 months and its July named for Julius Caesar and its August named for Augustus, is Roman. The language in which law is practiced across half the world descends from Latin spoken in the Forum. The apartment building you may live in, with its ground-floor shops and its upper-floor residences, is an insula by another name. The aqueduct principle, gravity-fed water delivered across distance to a concentrated population, still operates in modified form in every modern water system. The public bath survived in the hammam of the Islamic world, which inherited it directly from Roman models in Syria and North Africa. The lunch counter survived everywhere. Even the complaints survived. Marshall's grievances about noisy neighbors, cramped apartments, bad landlords, and overpriced rent in a city that everyone hates, but no one leaves read like a thread on social media about any major city today. The Roman experience of urban life, its mixture of convenience and misery, its anonymity and intimacy, its ambition and exhaustion, was so thoroughly modern that it does not feel ancient at all. It feels like yesterday, because in many ways it was. The Pompeian Thermopolium, excavated in 2020, still had food residue in its serving jars. Archaeologists identified traces of pork, fish, snail, and bean stew. The painted counter showed a rooster, a dog on a leash, and a sea nymph riding a seahorse. Someone had scratched graffiti into the plaster. It was not poetry. It was not philosophy. It was a crude insult about a man named Nietzsche, the kind of scrawl you might find on a bathroom wall in any bar, in any city in the world tonight. 2,000 years. A buried counter. A scratched insult. A pot of bean stew that no one ever came back to finish. Tomorrow morning you will wake up. You will check the time. You will eat something quick. You will leave your apartment and join a stream of strangers heading to work through noisy streets. Around midday, you will grab a fast meal you barely taste. By late afternoon, your body will be tired, but your mind will be restless, so you will go somewhere to unwind. Then you will come home, eat dinner, and the city outside your window will keep making noise long after you want silence. You will do all of this without once thinking about where the routine came from. Now you know.